The galaxy thought humanity was soft, fragile flesh and fleeting lifespans. When the Vorlag raiders breached Sector 4, they laughed at the cowering alien elites and the trembling human janitor holding a mop. They didn't realize they had just locked themselves in a titanium cage with the Reaper. No one ever looks at a janitor. On a deep space refining hub like Tereshkova 9, where a dozen different alien species broker billion-credit deals and swagger through the neon-lit promenades in customized power armor, a human in a faded gray jumpsuit is less than an afterthought. He is part of the scenery. A smudge on the pristine plasteel floors. His name tag read Albert, just Albert. No surname, no corporate affiliation, no military rank. He was a man in his late 50s. His hair a shock of wiry gray, his face weathered like cracked leather, and his shoulders perpetually slumped beneath an invisible weight. He walked with a slight, shuffling limp, dragging his mag boots across the deck as he pushed a hovering sanitation cart. To the station's inhabitants, Albert was the butt of a universal joke. Humanity was a relatively new addition to the Galactic Coalition, tolerated for their engineering ingenuity but widely considered physically inferior. They lacked the natural chitin of the Krell, the telepathic resonance of the Sylvans, or the terrifying, 7-foot muscular bulk of the Taurian enforcers. Mind, the spill, ape, a guttural voice rumbled. Albert stopped his cart. Standing before him was Commander Korvath, the Taurian head of station security. Korvath was a mountain of blue-gray scales and corded muscle, wearing ceremonial gold-trimmed armor. In his massive, clawed hand, he held a half-empty canister of hyperale. With a sneer that exposed rows of serrated teeth, Korvath intentionally inverted the canister, letting the sticky, pungent liquid pour directly onto the deck Albert had just sanitized. A few passing alien merchants chuckled. A group of human corporate liaisons led by Director Thomas Sterling, a slick, opportunistic bureaucrat, averted their eyes, too cowardly to defend their own species against the station's chief of security. Albert didn't speak. He didn't sigh. He simply stared at the puddle. His breathing remained perfectly even. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. A rhythmic, meditative cycle. Underneath his oversized jumpsuit, muscles as dense as coiled steel cable twitched. But on the surface, he was the picture of pathetic submissiveness. "Are you deaf, human?" Korvath barked, stepping closer. The alien's shadow enveloped Albert. "Clean it. Your species is only good for scrubbing the filth from our boots. Do not make me report your incompetence to Sterling." "Right away, Commander," Albert said. His voice was raspy, quiet, devoid of any inflection. He reached for his mop, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the floor. "Pathetic," Korvath spat, shouldering past the older man with enough force to send Albert stumbling into the bulkhead. The Taurian squad laughed, their heavy boots clanking down the corridor. Albert slowly righted himself. He didn't rub his shoulder. He just picked up his mop. "I am so sorry about him, Albert," a soft voice said. Albert looked up slightly. It was Batya Jenkins, a junior diagnostics engineer. She was young, barely 24, fresh from the academies on Earth. She was one of the few people on Tereshkova 9 who treated Albert like a human being. She handed him a sterilized wipe from her utility belt. "It's fine, Miss Jenkins," Albert murmured, keeping his gaze averted. "It's not fine," Batya whispered fiercely, glancing nervously down the hall where Korvath had disappeared. "You don't have to let them treat you like that. You could file a grievance with Director Sterling. You're a veteran, aren't you? I saw the old UNN tattoo on your wrist once." "You served." Albert pulled his sleeve down sharply, hiding the faded black ink on his forearm. "I just clean the floors, Miss Jenkins. That's all I do. I suggest you get back to engineering. The plasma conduits in Sector 4 have been running hot. You don't want to be late." Batya sighed, recognizing the impenetrable wall Albert threw up whenever his past was mentioned. "All right, Albert, just stay safe out there." As she walked away, Albert resumed his mopping. He pushed the sponge over the spilled ale, erasing the mess with methodical, mindless repetition. Batya thought she knew him. She thought he was just a tired old soldier who had seen a bit of combat and retired to a quiet life. She thought his submission was born of fear. She didn't know that Albert's limp was fake. She didn't know that his slumped posture was a deliberate disguise to hide the biomechanical enhancements woven into his spine. And she certainly didn't know that the breathing technique he used wasn't to calm his fear, it was to suppress the violent, overwhelming instinct to rip Commander Korvath's throat out with his bare hands. For 15 years, Albert had kept the beast locked in a dark, silent cage at the back of his mind. He had traded his combat armor for a mop because he knew the cost of war. He was the sole survivor of the Perseus annihilation, the man who had ordered the orbital bombardment of a rogue planet to stop a parasitic invasion, burning billions to save trillions. He had walked away from the United Nations Navy, a ghost, burying his medals and his true name. The galaxy didn't know the name Albert Pendleton, but the nightmares of the deepest, darkest corners of the universe still whispered the name he had earned, the Reaper. Albert wrung out his mop. He just wanted peace. He just wanted to be forgotten. But the universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. The peace shattered exactly 3 hours later. Albert was in the dimly lit bowels of the station, navigating the maintenance shafts beneath the primary engineering bay. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and recycled sweat. He was routinely checking the filtration units when the station-wide sirens began to scream. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of a minor hull breach or a localized fire. It was the jagged, high-pitched wail of a class, one incursion, boarders. The deck violently pitched beneath his feet, throwing him against the metal grating. A deep, thunderous boom echoed through the station's superstructure, vibrating in Albert's teeth. The heavy blast doors of the commercial sectors were slamming shut. Albert pulled a battered personal terminal from his pocket and tapped into the station's unsecured security feed. He watched as the external cameras showed 3 jagged, blackened cruisers latched onto the side of Tereshkova, 9 like metallic leeches. Vorlag. Albert's blood ran cold. The Vorlag weren't standard pirates. They were a nomadic race of ruthless marauders, a brutal mix of biological nightmares and crude cybernetic augmentations. They didn't just steal cargo. They took slaves, harvested organs, and slaughtered for sport. He switched the feed to the internal cameras in Sector 4, the engineering bay where Batya Jenkins had gone. The feed flickered, displaying a scene of absolute carnage. The heavy blast doors of the engineering bay had been blown off their hinges. Dozens of Vorlag raiders poured into the room. They were grotesque, standing 6 feet tall, their bodies wrapped in rusty, spiked armor, wielding hyper-vibrating cleavers and heavy plasma scatterguns. Commander Korvath and his vaunted Taurian security team had arrived to intercept them. Albert watched the so-called elite guards engage. The Taurians were strong, but they fought like duelists, relying on intimidation and ceremonial tactics. The Vorlag fought like rabid dogs. Within 90 seconds, the security feed showed 3 Taurian guards lying dead in pools of their own blue blood. Korvath, roaring in fury, swung a shock baton at a massive Vorlag brute. The raider simply stepped inside the guard's reach, drove a cybernetic fist into Korvath's kneecap, and slammed the butt of a scattergun into the back of the commander's head. Korvath went down hard, dropping his weapon, reduced to a groaning, helpless heap. The remaining engineers, including Batya Jenkins and Director Sterling, were huddled in the corner, corralled by the raiders. Sterling was weeping openly, holding his hands up in surrender, offering the raiders access codes if they would just spare his life. The Vorlag leader, a towering monstrosity with half its face replaced by a crude optic sensor, kicked Sterling aside. He grabbed Batya by the collar of her uniform, lifting her effortlessly into the air. She screamed, kicking her legs, as the leader pressed a jagged blade against her cheek, chittering in a harsh, clicking language to his subordinates. Down in the maintenance shaft, Albert watched the screen. His thumb hovered over the power button. "It's not your fight," a tired voice in his head whispered. "You did your time. You paid your dues. You've shed enough blood to drown this station. Walk away. Get to the escape pods." He watched Batya's terrified face on the grainy screen. He watched the arrogant Commander Korvath bleeding on the floor, entirely useless. He remembered the smell of the spilled ale, the laughter of the aliens, the constant, suffocating humiliation he had endured, just to prove to himself that he could be a normal man. Albert closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. But this time, it wasn't to suppress the beast. It was to open the cage. When Albert opened his eyes, the tired, submissive janitor was dead. His posture straightened, the artificial limp vanished, and his spine popped as he drew himself up to his full height. His eyes, usually clouded with forced apathy, went entirely flat and cold, the eyes of a dead man walking. He turned away from the filtration unit and walked briskly down the cramped corridor to a dead-end panel marked high voltage, do not open. Albert didn't have the key. He didn't need one. He drove his fist into the center of the reinforced plasteel. The metal buckled under the force of his cybernetically enhanced strike. He grabbed the torn edges and ripped the panel off the wall, tossing it aside like cardboard. Behind the panel was a biometric safe he had smuggled aboard 5 years ago. He pressed his thumb to the scanner. It flashed green. The heavy drawer slid open. Inside lay the ghosts of his past. He reached in and pulled out a matte black tactical rig, slipping it over his gray jumpsuit. Next came the weapon, a UNN-issue X-90 Widowmaker kinetic slug thrower, illegal on almost every civilized world. It didn't fire polite plasma bolts. It fired armor-piercing depleted uranium slugs that could punch through an armored bulkhead. He slapped a drum magazine into the receiver and racked the charging handle with a satisfying, heavy clack. Finally, he grabbed the combat knife, a 12-inch blade of monomolecular carbon. He slid it into the sheath on his chest rig. Above him, the screams from the engineering bay echoed through the vents. Albert stepped beneath the maintenance hatch that led directly up into the rear of Sector 4. He didn't climb the ladder. He crouched, his augmented leg muscles coiling, and leaped upward, smashing through the metal grate like a missile, landing silently on the catwalk above the engineering bay. Down below, the Vorlag leader threw Batia to the ground, raising his plasma scattergun to execute Korvath as an example. The Taurian commander, stripped of his pride, squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the end. Albert didn't shout. He didn't issue a warning. The Reaper didn't talk. He raised the Widowmaker, sighted down the holographic reticle, and pulled the trigger. The thunderous roar of the kinetic weapon shattered the ambient noise of the room. The high-velocity slug struck the Vorlag leader's weapon hand, severing it at the wrist in an explosion of black blood and shattered bone. The alien roared in shock, spinning around. Every Vorlag raider in the room, along with the terrified hostages and the bleeding security chief, jerked their heads upward to the catwalk. Standing in the shadows, looking down at them not as a victim, but as an apex predator, was the human janitor. Albert stepped out of the darkness. The barrel of his rifle smoked slightly. He looked down at the 20 heavily armed alien marauders. He didn't see an overwhelming force. He saw targets, and the Reaper had a lot of work to do. For 3 agonizing seconds, the engineering bay was locked in a tableau of absolute, suffocating silence. The only sound was the wet, heavy slap of the Vorlag leader's severed hand hitting the grated plasteel floor, its thick, scaly fingers still reflexively twitching around the grip of the plasma scattergun. Then, the screaming began. The Vorlag leader unleashed a sound that was half shriek, half gurgle, clutching his spurting stump as dark, viscous blood sprayed across the deck. The 19 remaining raiders snapped out of their shock. They raised their weapons toward the catwalk, their optic sensors and targeting lasers painting the darkness with a frantic, intersecting web of red beams. They expected the shooter to take cover. In their crude, brutal experience of galactic warfare, a lone sniper always fired and retreated. They expected suppressing fire, panic, or a desperate tactical withdrawal. They didn't know they were fighting a ghost. They didn't know this man was forged in the classified, subterranean laboratories of Earth's General Dynamics, his nervous system rewired by DARPA's Black Book Revenant program. They didn't know that beneath Albert's gray, blood-spattered jumpsuit lay a dermal layer of DuPont Kevlar weave, or that his visual cortex was currently being fed real-time threat assessments by a Palantir predictive combat algorithm hardwired directly into his brainstem. Albert didn't hide. He didn't flinch. He simply stepped straight over the railing. He fell 20 feet. He didn't brace or roll. His reinforced skeletal structure, laced with titanium carbide, and the synthetic Boston Dynamics shock dampeners woven into his calves absorbed the massive kinetic impact perfectly. His heavy mag boots hit the heavy plasteel deck with a resounding, concussive crack that vibrated through the boots of every alien in the room. He landed precisely in the dead center of the Vorlag formation. Before the aliens could even adjust their aim downward, the Reaper went to work. He moved with a terrifying, liquid efficiency. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no primal battle cries to psych himself up. He was a biological machine executing a flawless, lethal algorithm. The X-90 Widowmaker barked boom boom, boom boom. The weapon, a terrifying evolution of old Heckler and Koch kinetic designs, fired in disciplined, 2-round bursts. Unlike the slow, searing bolts of alien plasma that the galaxy relied on, the human kinetic slugs traveled at Mach 4. The depleted uranium penetrators tore through the Vorlag's crude, rusty, ablative armor as if it were wet parchment. The first Raider's chest cavity exploded outward in a localized mist of black ichor, the over-penetrating round continuing on to shatter the armored knee of the alien standing 3 feet behind him. Albert pivoted perfectly on his heel, driving the heavy tungsten-laced stock of his rifle into the faceplate of a third Raider who had lunged at him with a hyper-vibrating cleaver. The alien's skull caved in with a sickening, wet crunch, the momentum of Albert's strike snapping the creature's neck instantly. Kill the flesh bag, burn him to ash. The wounded Vorlag leader roared in his clicking, guttural native tongue, struggling to draw a heavy sidearm with his offhand while bleeding out on the deck. A chaotic storm of plasma bolts hissed through the air, scorching the bulkheads, melting the diagnostic consoles, and setting the ambient oxygen on fire. Albert ducked and wove beneath the volleys of superheated energy. His internal Raytheon acoustic sensors mapped the trajectory of every fired weapon before the plasma even left the barrels. His body was a blur of gray fabric and matte black tactical gear. He dropped the empty drum magazine from his rifle, letting it hit the floor, and slapped a fresh one into the receiver with a sharp, metallic clatter. He resumed firing in the exact same fluid motion, dropping 2 more Raiders who tried to flank him. Commander Korvath, lying pinned behind a demolished diagnostic console, watched the carnage in absolute, paralyzed disbelief. The Taurian military doctrine preached overwhelming brute force, frontal assaults, roaring intimidation, and honorable, face-to-face combat. What he was witnessing was an entirely different, terrifying philosophy of war. This human wasn't fighting a battle. He was executing an extermination protocol. The room grew too crowded for the long barrel of the Widowmaker. A towering Vorlag brute charged through the smoke, swinging a heavy, spiked chain aimed directly at Albert's head. Albert sidestepped the sweeping arc by a fraction of an inch, grabbing the alien's thick wrist and using the creature's own massive momentum to hurl it violently into the path of friendly plasma fire. As the brute fell, screaming and burning from its comrades' weapons, Albert let the Widowmaker drop to its tactical sling. His right hand flashed to his chest rig, drawing his combat knife. It wasn't a glowing energy sword. It was a 12-inch blade of bench-made high-carbon steel, honed to a monomolecular edge that could split a human hair lengthwise. He moved strictly into close-quarters combat. A Raider lunged with a serrated bayonet. Albert slipped inside the weapon's reach, his left hand snapping out like a viper to crush the alien's windpipe with a sickening pop. Simultaneously, his right hand buried the carbon blade under the chin of another attacker charging from his blind spot, driving the steel straight up through the soft tissue and into the brain pan. He twisted the blade to sever the motor cortex, yanked it free in a spray of dark blood, and drew a Sig Sauer kinetic sidearm from his hip, shooting the choking Raider in the chest without even looking. Over in the far corner, Batya Jenkins huddled against the cold metal wall, her hands clamped desperately over her ears, tears streaming through the grime on her face. Director Thomas Sterling was curled tightly in a fetal position beneath a desk, sobbing hysterically as the deafening roar of human gunfire and the gurgling alien shrieks filled the enclosed space. Within 45 seconds of Albert's boots hitting the deck, The slaughter was over. 19 elite Vorlag raiders lay dead or dying on the deck, their heavily armored bodies leaking dark, pooling fluids onto the pristine plasteel floors. Albert had been quietly mopping just hours ago. The air was thick and unbreathable, choked with the suffocating stench of ozone, vaporized blood, cordite, and burnt alien meat. Only the Vorlag leader remained. He was backed hard against the heavy blast doors, his surviving hand trembling violently as he pointed a crude, sparking pulse pistol at Albert. The towering monstrosity was hyperventilating, his single organic eye wide with an emotion the predatory Vorlag species rarely, if ever, experienced. Pure, paralyzing terror. Albert stood perfectly motionless amidst the smoking carnage. His chest rose and fell in that same, measured rhythm. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The Widowmaker hung casually against his side. His gray janitorial jumpsuit was ruined, heavily splattered with black gore and scorched at the edges. What are you?" the alien leader rasped in heavily accented, broken galactic standard, his voice trembling. Humans are weak. You are soft flesh." Albert walked slowly toward him. He didn't raise his weapons. He simply walked, his mag boots crunching heavily over the broken glass, spent brass casings, and shattered armor of the dead. "We are soft," Albert said, his raspy voice dead quiet in the echoing, smoke-filled bay. "We bleed. We age. We break." He stopped just 2 feet from the towering alien, looking up into his terrified, widened eye. "But we are very, very good at making sure you break first." With blinding speed, Albert's left hand shot out, grabbing the glowing barrel of the alien's pulse pistol. The Vorlag panicked and pulled the trigger, but Albert had already crushed the weapon's firing mechanism, the cheap alloy groaning and snapping under his biomechanical grip. With a casual, almost dismissive flick of his wrist, Albert stepped inside the leader's guard and drove his combat knife deep into the gap between the heavy chest plates, precisely puncturing the creature's primary heart. The alien gasped, a wet rattle escaping his throat. He dropped the ruined pistol, his massive knees buckling, and collapsed backward like a felled oak tree. Silence descended upon the engineering bay once more, save for the low, sparking hum of the surviving atmospheric scrubbers and the heavy breathing of the terrified hostages. Albert pulled a sterilized wipe from his utility belt, the very same one Batya had given him earlier to clean his mop. He calmly, methodically wiped the thick black blood from his blade, sheathed it with a soft click, and turned his cold, flat eyes to face the survivors. Commander Korvath struggled to a sitting position, his massive blue-gray hand clutching his shattered kneecap. He looked from the slaughtered Vorlag elite to the human janitor, his reptilian brain failing to process the contradiction. "By the ancestors," Korvath wheezed, spitting a wad of blue blood onto the deck. You are a demon." Albert walked over to the puddle of blood near the Towerian. He looked at Korvath with those dead, flat eyes. "Mind the spill, Commander." Korvath flinched, the arrogance utterly drained from him. "Albert?" Batya's voice was barely a whisper. She was shaking violently, clutching a heavy wrench as if it offered any protection. She looked at the man who had quietly cleaned her workspace for 3 years, a man she had pitied. "Albert." "How?" Albert's expression softened for a fraction of a second when he looked at her. The cage door swung shut just a little. "I told you, Miss Jenkins. I served." "That's not service." Director Sterling suddenly shrieked, scrambling to his feet. His slick hair was disheveled, his expensive suit stained. He pointed a trembling finger at Albert's matte black rig. "I know what that armor is. I saw the General Dynamics stamp on that rifle. You're not normal military. You're a black site operative, an assassin." Sterling backed away, panic overtaking reason. "You're a war criminal. The UNN executed all the Revenant operatives after the Perseus annihilation. Clearly, they missed one," Albert said flatly. He didn't care what Sterling thought of him. He cared about the tactical situation. He walked over to the dead Vorlag leader and knelt, ripping a heavily encrypted communication pad from the alien's wrist. He pulled a small interface cable from his gauntlet and jacked it directly into the pad. His cybernetic optical implants whirred, rapidly translating the alien ciphers flashing across the screen. "They breached Sector 4 for a reason," Albert muttered, reading the tactical net. "The Vorlag don't use precision strikes. They swarm. But this was a surgical team. They bypassed the commercial sectors entirely." He looked up, his eyes locking onto Sterling. They were looking for the vault. Sterling went completely pale. I don't know what you're talking about." Albert stood up. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing Sterling by the lapels of his suit and slamming him violently against the bulkhead. The bureaucrat gasped for air, his feet dangling inches off the floor. "Listen to me very carefully, Director," Albert said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural whisper. "I have killed more people than the plague. Do not test my patience." The Vorlag comms show they were given a backdoor security code to bypass the external sensor net. "The code came from your terminal. What is in the vault?" "Put him down, human," Korvath barked, his old security instincts flaring up, though he made no move to stand. Albert ignored the Taurian. He pressed his forearm against Sterling's throat. "What did you sell them, Thomas?" Okay, Sterling gagged, tears leaking from his eyes. "The Hyperion core. It's a prototype, dark matter compression. The Coalition banned the research, but I contracted a private team to finish it down here. It's worth billions on the black market. You sold out the entire station," Batia said, her voice trembling with sudden fierce anger. "You invited a Vorlag warlord here for a payout? They were just supposed to take it and leave," Sterling cried, looking pathetically at Albert. "They weren't supposed to kill anyone. I swear. They double-crossed me." Pirates with a poor sense of honor. Shocking. Albert deadpanned. He dropped Sterling to the deck in a heap. The station shook violently again. Another massive explosion echoed through the superstructure, this time closer. The lights in the engineering bay flickered and died, replaced by the ominous, pulsing crimson glow of emergency klaxons. Albert looked at the Vorlag datapad. "The main raiding party has breached the central promenade. They have a warlord with them. They're slaughtering the security forces and moving toward the vault. If they get that dark matter core, they'll use it to power a dreadnought. Whole planets will burn. Then we have to evacuate." Sterling babbled, crawling toward the rear exit. "The escape pods in Sector 6 are still active. The Vorlag have locked down the hangar bays. They're taking prisoners for the slave pits," Albert said coldly. He ejected the partially spent drum from his Widowmaker, checked the action, and slapped a fresh one in. He checked the seal on his combat knife and tightened the straps on his armor. Korvath watched the human prepare. "You cannot be serious. There are over 200 Vorlag on this station. Their warlord is heavily augmented. He is a walking tank. You are one aging human. You cannot stop an entire raiding party." Albert picked up his mop. He looked at the dirty, blood-soaked sponge, and then looked at Korvath. "Commander," Albert said softly, "do you know why humanity doesn't build our soldiers to be 7 feet tall and covered in scales?" Korvath blinked, confused by the question. "Because your genetics are inferior. Because a smaller target is harder to hit," Albert corrected him. "And because true monsters don't need to look frightening to be lethal." He tossed the mop onto the floor. "Keep the girl safe, Commander. If I find out she got a scratch on her, I'll finish what the Vorlag started." "Where are you going?" Batia asked, taking a step toward him. "Albert, please, you don't have to do this. You've fought enough." Albert paused at the blasted doorway of the engineering bay. He looked back at the young engineer, the only person who had shown him a shred of kindness in a cold, unforgiving galaxy. The tired, broken janitor was gone. The Reaper stood in his place, bearing the weight of 1,000 dead worlds on his shoulders. "I tried to be quiet, Miss Jenkins," Albert said, his voice carrying a profound, weary sorrow. "I really did. But some messes you can't clean with a mop." He turned and disappeared into the smoke-filled, blood-red corridor, heading straight toward the heart of the invasion. The central promenade of Tereshkova 9 had been designed as a glittering testament to galactic commerce and unity. Now, it was an abattoir. The neon signs advertising exotic off-world liquors sparked and sputtered, casting long, erratic shadows over the bodies of the station's slaughtered defense forces. Albert moved through the carnage not as a man running into battle, but as a scalpel cutting through diseased tissue. He did not charge down the main corridors. He used the station's architecture against the invaders. His neural lace, retrofitted with old, classified predictive analytics originally developed by Palantir Technologies on Earth, processed the tactical environment in milliseconds. He could hear the heavy, undisciplined footfalls of a Vorlag patrol moving parallel to his position. He glanced at the bulkheads, calculating structural integrity and material density. He didn't need to see them. He just needed to know where they were going to be. Albert raised the Widowmaker. He tracked the acoustic signatures of the patrol moving behind the plasteel wall to his right. He led his target by 2 feet, accounted for the wall's thickness, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy rifle roared. 3 depleted uranium slugs punched straight through the wall. On the other side, agonized shrieks erupted as the armor-piercing round shredded the patrol leader and the 2 raiders behind him. Before the surviving aliens could even register where the fire had come from, Albert was already moving, vaulting over a shattered kiosk and disappearing into the service vents. He systematically dismantled the raiding party. To the Vorlag, it felt as though they were fighting an entire platoon of elite specters. They would secure a corridor, only for their rearguard to be found seconds later with their throats cleanly severed by a monomolecular blade. They would set up overlapping plasma turret kill zones, only for a blindingly fast shadow to drop from the ceiling, planting kinetic rounds into their skulls before gravity even allowed them to hit the floor. Within 15 minutes, Albert had reduced the secondary raiding force of 60 heavily armed aliens to 0. His gray jumpsuit was scorched, and a grazing plasma bolt had cauterized a deep groove along his left bicep. But the DARPA-engineered pain inhibitors in his bloodstream kept his heart rate at a steady, terrifying resting pace. He reached the primary access corridor to the vault. The heavy vault doors, rated to withstand a localized nuclear blast, had been melted into slag. Standing amidst the glowing metallic ruin was the Vorlag warlord. He was a hulking behemoth, easily 8 feet tall, but what caught Albert's attention wasn't the alien's sheer mass. It was the hardware grafted into the creature's flesh. The warlord's left arm had been amputated and replaced with a heavily modified, shoulder-mounted rotary cannon. His chest was plated with unmistakable, honeycomb-patterned, ablative armor. It was stolen human technology, Northrop Grumman mil-spec plating. The warlord turned, his single organic eye narrowing as he spotted the lone human stepping into the flickering light of the corridor. 2 of the warlord's elite bodyguards raised their weapons, but the warlord barked a harsh command, waving them down. I wondered why my comms were going dark. The warlord hissed, his mechanical translation collar crackling with static. He stared at Albert's matte black rig. That armor. I stripped this plating from a human ghost ship in the Perseus sector 10 cycles ago. They told me the UNN wiped out your kind. The Revenants. They tried, Albert said, his voice a rasping whisper that echoed in the quiet corridor. You are a long way from home, little ghost, the warlord mocked, a cruel smile stretching across his scarred face. But you are too late. The core is mine. He stepped aside, revealing the Hyperion core suspended in a containment field. But as Albert's optical implants scanned the device, a red warning interface flashed across his vision. Twist. Sterling hadn't just built a power source. The containment field was fluctuating wildly. The dark matter compression was failing by design. It wasn't a battery. It was a localized singularity bomb, designed to be sold to the highest bidder to vaporize rival corporate outposts. Sterling had lied to everyone. If the warlord removed the core from its housing, the containment field would instantly collapse. It wouldn't just destroy Tereshkova, 9. It would rip a hole in space-time that would consume the entire quadrant. You can't move it, Albert stated. his grip tightening on the Widowmaker. The containment matrix is rigged to the deck. If you break the seal, it detonates. We all die. The warlord laughed, a booming, horrific sound. Human lies. You only wish to keep the prize for your weak coalition. The warlord raised his rotary cannon. Albert didn't dive for cover. He sprinted straight forward. The rotary cannon spun up with a high-pitched whine, unleashing a torrent of blue plasma that turned the corridor into a blinding inferno. Albert slid on his knees, the superheated air blistering his skin even through the tactical rig. He brought the Widowmaker up and fired a continuous burst, aiming not for the warlord's thick torso, but for the unprotected joints of his elite bodyguards. The two towering aliens collapsed, their knees shattered, before Albert finished them with a double tap to their helmets. The warlord roared, tracking Albert with the heavy cannon. Plasma fire melted the deck plates, where Albert had been a fraction of a second before. Albert's Lockheed Martin bioweave muscles strained as he propelled himself off the bulkhead, launching into the air. He landed directly on the warlord's chest. The alien was massive, but Albert was pure, condensed kinetic energy. Before the warlord could swat him away, Albert drew his monomolecular combat knife. He didn't aim for flesh. He drove the carbon blade straight down into the exposed power coupling connecting the Northrop Grumman armor to the warlord's rotary cannon. Sparks showered in a blinding arc. The cannon misfired, the internal battery overloading. The warlord screamed, wildly swinging his massive, organic right arm, catching Albert in the ribs. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. Albert heard two of his reinforced ribs crack as he was thrown backward, crashing hard against the vaulted wall. Albert coughed, tasting copper. He forced himself up, his targeting reticle flickering. The warlord, enraged and bleeding from the electrical feedback, tore the ruined cannon from his shoulder and charged at Albert with his bare, clawed hands, intending to rip the human in half. Albert dropped the empty Widowmaker. He stood perfectly still, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. He waited until the behemoth was exactly 1 yard away. Then, Albert stepped inside the creature's guard. He parried a massive clawed swipe with his left forearm, the titanium bones inside his flesh groaning under the immense pressure. With his right hand, he drove the combat knife upward, sliding the 12-inch blade directly beneath the edge of the stolen human chest plate, piercing the warlord's primary respiratory organ and sliding smoothly into his brainstem. The warlord's momentum carried them both forward, crashing to the floor. The giant alien twitched once, a gurgling sound escaping his throat, and died. Albert shoved the massive corpse off him. He was bleeding, exhausted, and covered in a mixture of his own blood and alien ichor. He limped over to the Hyperion core. He bypassed Sterling's crude biometric locks, accessed the terminal, and initiated a hard-coded thermal shutdown, permanently fusing the dark matter into inert slag. The glowing core faded to black. The threat was neutralized. When the heavy Galactic Coalition cruisers finally arrived 3 hours later, heavily armored shock troops stormed the station, expecting a massacre. They found one, but not the kind they anticipated. Over 200 Vorlag raiders lay dead. The hostages in Sector 4 were untouched, guarded by a terrified but alive Commander Korvath. Director Sterling was found locked inside a waste disposal locker, screaming about a human demon. When Batya Jenkins led the Coalition commanders down to the vault, they found the warlord's corpse, the inert core, and absolute silence. Albert was gone. He didn't leave a manifesto. He didn't leave a warning. Resting neatly against the warlord's ruined armor was a standard issue, gray sanitation mop, completely spotless. The Reaper had cleaned up his mess and faded back into the dark. The galaxy learned a terrifying truth that day. Humanity might look small, fragile, and unassuming. They might sweep floors, broker quiet trade deals, and smile politely when insulted by towering brutes. But beneath that soft exterior lies a terrifying capacity for destruction. They do not boast of their monsters, they bury them, and God help the foolish universe that forces humanity to dig up their ghosts.